Heights. In 1973, this rocky terrain on the Israel-Syria border turns into a killing ground.
The Golan Heights is Syrian territory, and Syria cannot, will not concede it.
A few hundred unprepared Israeli tankers come face to face with 1,200 Syrian tanks.
All I see, from horizon to horizon, the entire Syrian army starts to drive across for me.
This was a no-holds-barred fight, and neither side backed down from it.
The Golan Heights. 1,200 square kilometers of the most hotly contested real estate on the planet.
It's Dante. It's inconceivable. It's an inferno.
The Golan Heights. 1,200 square kilometers of the most hotly contested real estate on the planet. It's a barren, volcanic escarpment that has been occupied by Israel since the Six-Day Arab-Israeli War of 1967. Both Israel and Syria claim it as their own. In the fall of 1973, that border dispute erupts into a sudden, ferocious, and bloody war. October 6th. It's Yom Kippur, the Jewish Day of Atonement. Most Israelis are at home, repenting for their sins and observing a fast, leaving the frontier with Syria lightly guarded. The commander of the 74th Israeli Tank Battalion, Lieutenant Colonel Yar Nafshi, begins a routine patrol.
It was simply pastoral peacefulness, and I am patrolling the positions along my front. At 12, a commander from the Hermon post calls me, and he says, "Yair, the Syrians are taking off their camouflage nets from their artillery." And then I act instinctively. So I turn my jeep around and gather all my men and say to them, "Look, the scenario is that the Syrian army is removing their camouflage screens. I don't know what this means." And the men stop fasting, mount their tanks, and start to prepare them. And as we are driving from the lots, the bombardment starts. The artillery lands on us, then planes of the Syrian Air Force attack.
The Syrians have been planning the attack for 9 months. Israeli intelligence had some clues, but for the men on the front, it's a complete surprise.
What these Syrians do is lull Israel into a false sense of security. The Israelis have seen the Syrians move all their troops up, get geared up for war, time and again, only to have them all go back to their bases. And so on the 6th of October, when the Syrians don't go back to their bases, the Israelis are caught completely off guard.
Israel is a small state, and they have perfected the art of mobilization. So it is in the first shots of the war that you want to accomplish as much as possible, so as not to bring the bulk of the Israeli army against you.
The majority of the Israeli forces are reservists who need 20 hours to fully mobilize. Consequently, Israeli forces on the Golan Heights consist of fewer than 6,000 light infantry, 60 artillery pieces, and 2 under-strength armored brigades with 170 tanks. In comparison, the Syrians have massed more than 50,000 infantry, 600 artillery pieces, and 1,200 main battle tanks.
This is a huge amount of armor. And over and above that, it was Yom Kippur in Israel. People were on holiday. The intelligence services in Israel were lax. the Arabs can't fight. And so, as a result, they were in for a very major surprise.
I thought to myself, what's going on? Who are those pilots, crazy pilots, what they're doing? And I thought this is Israeli by mistake, they are bombing us. I didn't realize that any aircraft from Syria can come across the border and start to bomb us. And I couldn't talk after that.
I crossed through the barrage of shells, wave after wave. In 5 minutes, I'm finally at the edge of Booster Ridge, viewing over half the Golan Heights. At first, it's small. And then, like rings of cigarette smoke, it slowly gets closer, bigger and bigger. And all I see, from horizon to horizon, the entire Syrian army starts to drive across from me.
But this is only part of a much larger war. Egypt and Syria have launched simultaneous attacks on 2 fronts, splitting Israeli defense forces. Their mission? To take back territory lost during the 6-day Arab-Israeli War, including the Sinai and the Golan Heights.
The Syrian body politic was humiliated, was traumatized. It is as a result of this that we had the 1973 war, a war that was made specifically in order to regain this territory that Israel occupied.
Over the course of time, they developed a campaign plan that was specifically tailored to retake the Golan and repair Syria's tarnished honor.
The Syrian battle plan is to use overwhelming force and penetrate the Israeli line at 2 points. Then send armored divisions through the gaps to advance across the Golan Plateau and seize key bridges over the Jordan River. At the spearhead of the Syrian attack are masses of the Soviet-designed T-55 tank. The T-55 at 40 tons is relatively small for a main battle tank, making it hard to hit. Its 100mm main cannon has an effective range of just 2,400 meters, no match for the bigger guns of the Israelis. But that disadvantage is offset by numbers. The Syrians attack the Golan Heights with more than 1,200 T-55s. The defending Israelis with their 170 tanks are outnumbered, almost 7 to 1.
The Syrians had rehearsed the initial attack on the Israeli positions countless times beforehand. But apparently, one thing that they hadn't quite planned out properly was where to put the bridging equipment. The Israelis had built a deep anti-tank trench in front of their positions all along the Golan front. But the Syrians had put their bridging equipment far back in their columns. And as a result, the first thing that happened was you had Syrian tankers who bizarrely drove straight at the Israelis, drove right into the tank ditch, and as a result were picked off like sitting ducks by Israeli tankers sitting up on the heights overlooking this anti-tank trench.
For the Israelis, the tank of choice on the rocky terrain of the Golan is the Shot-Kal, an upgraded version of the Centurion main battle tank. It's protected by 152mm of frontal armor and equipped with a 105mm rifled cannon, accurate at ranges in excess of 3,600 meters. The Shot-Kal is a formidable opponent to the Syrians' T-55s.
When David goes out to fight Goliath, he made a decision to fight him with a slingshot. And he knew he could defeat Goliath because he wouldn't enter in range of Goliath's weapons. And from outside that range, he hits him with a rock and knocks him over. I am going to be David. The Syrians don't open fire from ranges further than 2,200 meters, but I, in all my training, can fire and hit targets at about 5 kilometers.
4 קילומטר, 5 קילומטר.
The Israelis understood that in the terrain of the Middle East, where you often had very long fields of fire, being able to kill the other guy before he could kill you was a tremendous advantage. And so the Israelis had put a tremendous amount of effort into developing long-range gunnery skills. When the initial Syrian attack in the north floundered, the commanders decided that they would nevertheless try to mount some kind of a night operation to see if they couldn't get back on schedule. And so they pushed forward in the darkness. And at that moment, they had a tremendous advantage. The Syrian tanks had Soviet night fighting equipment. The Israelis didn't. And as a result, when the Syrians began to push into their lines, the Israelis were at a complete loss as to what to do or how to do it.
The hardest combat was during the night. It was dark and nobody used any lights. When you turn on the lights, immediately they kill you. Really, the main problem is during the night, they had infrared system.
Syrian infrared projectors enabled the T-55s to see through the dark, detecting targets up to 1,200 meters away. It's a huge advantage for the Syrians. The only defense the Israelis have are night vision binoculars that can detect the infrared beam.
One situation, I was looking to identify them, and I moved my face down, and I saw all the parts of my tank. I was surprised, what is dark? I moved my binocular, and I saw it's dark. I put it again in my face, I saw every part. And I found that 200 meters in front of me, one projector looked straight to my eyes with infrared system. And he identified me, he was ready to shoot. And I screamed to my driver, go far away, and we moved back. We shot to the direction they came from, just to give them the feeling that we are there waiting for them. They didn't know that we are blind.
The Syrians infiltrate Israeli positions through the night, and the line between the two tank armies becomes increasingly blurred.
One situation, I saw a tank beside my tank, 10 meters. The tank looks strange, and the stoplights turn on. I talked to the platoon leader. He was close to my tank. He said, there is a tank there, use the light and show me who is this tank. He didn't want first, of course, and I convinced him, I ordered him. And he put the lights in. I saw T-55. I was in shock. Of course, I shot him. At this moment, when he was on fire, I saw another tank close to him. I shot him too.
After 18 hours of almost continuous combat, the tankers of the 77th and 74th Israeli battalions have held the line in the North Golan Heights and pay a terrible price. Hundreds of dead and wounded, and 75 of their tanks destroyed. But for the Syrians, the price is even higher. The casualties number in the thousands, and more than 100 tanks are lost. But in the open terrain farther south, the Syrian offensive has been far more successful. They've wiped out an entire tank battalion, clearing the way for a push into the Israeli heartland.
Of course, I was as euphoric as all Arabs were to see images of Syria advancing in the Golan Heights.
The future, not just of Israel, but of the whole Middle East, now hangs in the balance. October 6, 1973, Egypt and Syria attack Israeli forces on two fronts. They're determined to take back all the territory they lost in the Six-Day War of 1967. Syrian armored brigades strike at 2 points on the Golan Heights, throwing 50,000 infantry and 1,200 tanks into the battle. In the rugged and hilly northern sector, Israeli defenders hold the line through the first day of fighting, even though they're outnumbered almost 7-1 and take heavy casualties. But in the more open country farther south, the Syrians seem unstoppable.
In the south, you had two very aggressive Syrian commanders. They dragged their bridging equipment forward. One of their commanders actually had his infantry fill in portions of the Israeli anti-tank trench by hand. They crossed over, and they were able to mass so much power against these thinned-out Israeli defenses in the southern flank of the Golan that they were able to punch through.
October 7th. After a day of fierce fighting, the Israeli southern line falls apart under a massive onslaught of Syrian armor. By 8 a.m., Syrian forces are advancing across the Golan Plateau, driving towards key bridges crossing the Jordan River.
The Syrian assumption was that if they could punch through those Israeli lines and drive as fast as they could, grab those bridges, they would effectively be able to prevent Israeli reserves from mounting a viable counterattack out of Galilee.
At 2 o'clock, when I heard the alarm, I opened immediately the radio. I heard the BBC announcing that the war started in Israel.
A heavy battle of armed forces is continuing on the Golan Heights, as Syrian armor has been attempting to break the Israeli line and has, according to the news here, been checked by Israeli tanks and artillery.
I called my unit, the brigade, and they told me, come immediately, there is a war. The roads were empty, I drove like a hell, and the feeling was that they caught us unprepared.
In 73, the tanks were bare of ammunition and equipment. They had to be loaded with shells and all of the equipment taken out of storage and organized.
If you have the full crew, which are 4 members, it takes something like 4 to 6 hours to prepare it really properly. But during the rush time, we didn't really prepare properly the tanks.
Everybody went to the Golan Heights, doesn't matter how many tanks he had, if the tanks are completely equipped or not. They just went.
Syrian intelligence estimates it will take Israel 20 hours to mobilize its tank reserves, but the Israelis do it in 10. Throughout the night, Israeli reservists make their way to the battlefield, are hastily organized into units, and thrown into the fight against the Syrians. By the early hours of October 7th, the first tanks reach the Golan Heights.
In the early morning, we advanced towards the enemy already inside the Golan Heights. Dawn was beginning to break, and we saw lots of tanks. A mask of sorts came down. Now we have to do what is necessary. You don't think about it too much. We opened fire on them but directional alignments are required to match the barrel of the cannon to the cross of the telescope. But we didn't do this because of our hurried exit. We didn't hit them. It is possible to make battle time alignments, but this is a lot less precise. But it's better than nothing. We hit a few tanks. But not long after this, I saw a very large cloud of dust coming from the southeast. And when this cloud got closer, it turns out that it was a very large Syrian force with T-62 tanks.
It's the last thing the outnumbered Israelis want to see on the battlefield. The T-62 is an upgraded version of the T-55. Those upgrades include 240 millimeters of frontal armor and a bigger 581 horsepower engine. But the biggest threat is the T-62's 115 millimeter Molot main cannon. Its smooth bore design increases muzzle velocity, giving it a range of nearly 3,000 meters.
And then I honestly started to feel that I was being targeted, and shells are falling beside me or behind me. And if the first one is long, the next shell will be short, and then the next will hit me. So I reverse off the firing ramp and look for a new position. We started the battle with maybe 5 or 6 tanks against this very large Syrian force. All that was left for us to do was try to fight a stalling battle, but they simply pushed us backward.
It's overwhelming. 4 Syrian brigades, 350 tanks, push through Israeli defenders and advance towards the bridges over the Jordan River.
Before dark, both of them run into very small groups of Israeli infantry. And even though at this point in time they're only a couple of kilometers from their objectives, both brigade commanders decide to stop for the evening, and with almost nothing standing in their way. The bridges were sitting there. They were theirs for the Syrians' taking. When they woke up the next morning, they found strong Israeli forces guarding those 2 bridges.
My battalion met them on the road from the Betecha Valley up to the Golan Heights. The first tanks in our column, they didn't see them. Only the last tank saw them, and he began to shoot. And the commander shouted at him, "Why are you shooting? We are in our territory." He said, "This is Syrians, already here." We didn't believe that they arrived so west. Their problem was that the T-55 have only 5 degrees of degradation.
That means the cannon can't be aimed very far down. It's a disadvantage for a tank on higher ground, engaging an enemy approaching from below. Beyond that, the Israeli shot cows have a high degree of elevation, making it easier to hit targets above them.
They had to expose themselves if they wanted to have enough degradation to shoot at us. So when they expose themselves, we shoot them. So by that way, we succeed to stop them.
The real problem there was simply Syrian junior officers allow small Israeli forces to completely derail the one thing that might have actually secured victory for Syria, the drive to take the Jordan River bridges.
Israeli reserves from the 39th Battalion stopped the Syrian 1st Armored Division at Batea Road. But farther south, the Syrian offensive remains unopposed, as 40 tanks of the 132nd Mechanized Brigade advanced towards the small village of El Al.
I received orders to ascend to El Al and seal up what is known as the El Al position. It's a position between two deep canyons, about 2 kilometers wide. He who possesses it and successfully holds the position controls all routes down to the Sea of Galilee. At around 9 o'clock, through my binoculars, I start to identify what we in the armored call masses of dust. This means that you can see the clouds of dust far before you hear the noise. And through the binoculars, I notice some movement from a distance of about 4 kilometers.
That movement in the distance is an entire brigade of Syrian tanks. Their mission is to occupy the western edge of the Golan Heights, overlooking the Sea of Galilee. From here, the flatlands of Israel lie almost undefended and at the mercy of the advancing Syrians.
If they are successful and pass us, the Syrians will be at the Sea of Galilee, and I understand that a loss or even a retreat is not mine alone. It would be fatal.
October 7th, 1973. It is 20 hours into the Syrian attack on the Israeli-occupied Golan Heights. And in the rugged and rocky northern sector, 2 Israeli tank units struggle to hold off the Syrians. But in the flatter terrain of the southern Golan, masses of Syrian armor have rolled over the Israelis and are pushing on towards bridges over the Jordan River.
At around 9 o'clock, through my binoculars, I start to identify what we in the armored call masses of dust. This movement ahead becomes clearer and clearer, and then we start to identify Syrian tanks. They are getting closer and are stopping at distances of about 1,500 meters, and we start to notice a lot of strikes. At the plateau of El Al, it's absolutely flat. It's as if they put the tanks on a billiard table and said, "Please, go ahead and play now." You can see huge distances. There is nowhere to hide. And the only thing that can save you is your own capability, your own skill, and to always be on the move. I always make sure that the tanks are always moving and not firing more than what's called a ball to the target, which is just 2 or 3 shells, one after the other. We fire one and then adjust. We fire another and then move to another position. In order to get a target, you'd have to stop and stand. Then you bring the turret to a point where it is in line with the enemy tank. You give the range according to your estimation. When everyone announces on, I give the command to fire.
The Israelis, for their part, maneuvered constantly. They darted from firing position to firing position. Most Syrian armored units didn't maneuver at all. They simply drove straight at the Israelis.
And so this is really the big difference between the Syrian and Israeli armies. The Syrians, when they gain territory, they hang on to it to the death, which might be good, but is very bad if you need to maneuver.
The
simple fact is that the Syrian tankers are just no match for the Israeli counterparts. The Israelis have taken the best shots that Syria has to give, and they're now in a position with enough combat strength that they can begin to push back.
So we started to move unit by unit, and I found myself alone in Ramtania. There was 2 hills, and I was in the cradle, you know, of the hills, overlooking Hashnia village. I saw a regiment getting fueled or rearmed and so on. And I started to shoot at them. And I saw some Syrian tanks leaving the hills. And I started to hit one by one because they were standing one next to the other, very, very close.
The Syrian tanks are sitting ducks for the Israelis' high-explosive squash head, or Hesh round. On impact, they squash against the target and explode. Creating a shock wave that tears apart the inside of the tank.
I think I destroyed something like 7 tanks before they started to move and to understand that somebody is shooting at them. They shot back. Our tank started to bend. As we evacuated from the tank, after a few meters we left the tank, our tank exploded.
The outnumbered Israelis fall back and regroup, and the Syrians gear up for a final big offensive. By late evening on the 8th of October, they've assembled an entire armored division, over 250 tanks in Hashnia, a tiny hamlet in the South Golan, which is about to become ground zero in one of history's greatest tank battles. Hashnia, once a thriving village in the southern Golan Heights. Today it's a scattered collection of ruins, a grim monument to the ferocity of the 1973 Arab-Israeli War. Syrian and Israeli tank forces clashed here in a historic encounter, now simply remembered as the Battle of Hashnia. October 9th. The Syrian advance into the Golan loses steam, and they assemble an armored division, over 250 tanks at Hashnia, in preparation for a final big offensive. But in the 3 days since Syrian attacks on the Golan Heights began, the Israelis have mobilized hundreds of tanks and thousands of reserve soldiers. Most of them stream towards Hashnia for a showdown with the Syrians.
I received an order to cross the oil pipeline and advance and capture Hashnia. The Syrians held this place as their last stronghold on the Golan Heights. And for the first time since the war began, there was a plan for an organized attack with artillery and jets. The artillery started falling on Hashnia. And we, in 2 squads of tanks, started to advance, crossing the territory from the oil line towards the village of Hashnia. It's dusk, the last light, and you can see the entire village blazing, exploding, and the mosque of Hashnia in the middle of this whole thing. We advanced with the tanks, and the Syrians didn't escape. But it's dangerous because everything is exploding and blazing around us. It's Dante. It's inconceivable. It's an inferno. And then, from within the village, outburst Syrian tanks and trucks. They are terrified, trying to escape, and I see a Syrian tank, and it isn't clear if it is able to get out. But then, his turret starts moving in my direction, but my cannon and my turret are farther away. And it's completely clear that I won't be able to target him. He's going to get a bead on me first, and if he does, then I'm a goner. Behind me is one of my battalion officers, and he launches a shell, and the Syrian tank lights up. They are difficult displays to describe, but the Syrians ran for their lives.
The Israeli reserves destroy more than 200 tanks, stalling the Syrians' big push. By the afternoon of October 9th, the Israelis have retaken most of the southern Golan. But on the northern front, they are still struggling to hold off Syrian forces in a place that will soon become known as the Valley of Tears.
In the north, the remnants of the elite 7th Armored Brigade are still just barely holding back the Syrian 7th Infantry Division. The Syrians tried one last time to blast through the Israeli positions. They've got 200 tanks, half of them T-62s, and the Israelis are down to less than 30 Centurions.
We are currently located at the positions that control the Valley of Tears, which we see here in front of us. And when I arrive from Booster Ridge with 6 tanks, I realize that I am not going to make it to these positions, which are the best ones, and govern the entire width of the Valley of Tears. By now, Unit 7 has retreated back, and I find myself alone with 6 tanks. And I decide to make a defensive stand on the reverse slope. And I stop the 6 tanks and spread them out along the back slope of the hill that is located behind us. And I see the smoke from the exhaust of the Syrian tanks over the hill. And I tell my men, you, see those moving on the other side of the hill? You, take those 3. You, these 2. You, these 3. And I let the Syrians come right over the hill. I allow the Syrians to advance, and they head towards the top of the hill with the barrel of their cannons pointed upwards. And I wait for them. The battle opens at close range, around 300 to 400 meters. And we stopped their advance towards the main road. But in this battle, after we stopped the Syrian army, we had only 2 tanks left. On this side, at the foot of Mount Hermonite, we see today the same famous valley where the commander of the 77th Battalion, Colonel Kahalani, stood and blocked the Syrian advance through this valley.
When I came 2 kilometers from the hills, I saw far away Israeli tanks on fire and other tanks around them. It was Syrian tanks. And I moved with my tanks to the valley. I was in shock. I called my commander and said, if you have any tanks in the area, send them immediately.
October 9th, 1973. Israeli and Syrian tank forces had been fighting on the Golan Heights for 3 days, with heavy casualties on both sides. The Syrians outnumbered the Israelis and quickly gained the upper hand. But the Israelis pushed back with their reserve forces. Now time is running out for the Syrian army. They make one last attempt to break through Israeli defenses in the north, throwing an entire armored division into the battle.
They've got 200 tanks, half of them T-62s, and the Israelis are down to less than 30 Centurions.
The main forces is just behind the hill. If they will come to the top of the hills, nobody can stop them. They will run all the way to the Galilee. And I have decided to move forward and to catch the hills and to catch them on the valley.
It's a desperate gambit, and the only chance the Israelis have. They must regain their firing positions. And to do that, they have to cross 800 meters of open ground in the teeth of Syrian fire.
I ordered to move forward like it was written in the book. Nobody moved. And I've decided to move all of them to my frequency, to my radio. Every gunner, loader, driver, and tank commander, sergeant listened to my voice. And I told them, look, the Syrian soldiers, how they're fighting so well. Look at them. The motivation of them. What happened to us? Am I see chicken in my unit? Start to move. And I started to move. I saw another tank joined me, and another tank joined me. And I prayed to the God, just give me to arrive to the top of the hill, and we will catch them. And suddenly another tanks arrived to the hills. And we arrived. The valley was dark from tanks. And we shot like crazy. The moment that we've been on the fire position and they moved on the valley, this was easier for us to shoot all of them. I fought to survive. Some of them, they stopped and they shot and they killed my tanks. Survive around 3-4 tanks, no more than that. I remember that I was trying to count the tank that we shot all over, and I couldn't. So many.
After the battle, Israeli observers counted 500 Syrian tanks destroyed in that defile. And as a result, it came to be called the Valley of Tears for all of the Syrians killed there.
Syria's hope of retaking the Golan Heights ends in the Valley of Tears. On October 11th, the Israelis launched their own offensive into Syria. And on the 23rd, the Syrians capitulate. The battle for the Golan Heights is finally over.
This was simply competent Israeli commanders outthinking, outmoving, outfighting their Syrian opponents. But there's no question that the Syrians fought incredibly hard. They mounted attack after attack after attack into the teeth of ferocious Israeli defenses. And in many cases, they died to a man. This was a no-holds-barred fight, and neither side backed down from it.
The 1973 Arab-Israeli War lasts just 16 days, but those days are among the bloodiest in the history of armored warfare. The battlefields are left littered with the hulks of destroyed tanks. The Israelis lose between 400 and 500. The two Arab countries somewhere between 12 and 2,200. But the real tragedy is in the human cost on both sides. 21,000 dead and tens of thousands more wounded.
Most of my friends I lost during wars. They were 19, 20 years old, no more than that. And I saw them how they fight, and it's unbelievable. And I was very proud.
The war ended with disappointment, but it ended with a solemn promise by Syrians and to Syrians and of Syrians that they will get back the Golan Heights one day. If the Golan Heights is not returned to Syria, I dare say that there will not be peace in the Middle East.